Hey guys, Aaron here. For the first time on YouTube, I believe, today I'm going to be ranking the album's discography of a certain very popular, high-selling British artist, Rod Stewart. I started out as less of a fan than my mother. I grew up on her listening to The Story So Far, which was a 2 CD greatest hits collection, I think from early 2000s. At first I dismissed it as just not part of my generation, but I think eventually my fandom grew to even eclipse hers, and I now have several albums of his on physical copies, mostly CDs, and I did a search on YouTube and found that this ranking hadn't been done for this artist, which is a little unusual for such a popular and high-selling artist overall. So I'm happy to do this, and this was very fun. So I'm going to get to it because there's a lot to get through. Before I do get to it, just a real quick summary of my overall thoughts. Overall, he's an icon, mostly for his voice for most people. I think his topics dealt with standard stuff like love and heartache and stuff that maybe allowed for easily digestible material, but also kind of allowed for critics to maybe overlook him a bit compared to artists who were writing about sort of deeper topics. But I do think he had more than just his voice. I think up until 1981, from his debut in 1970, I think he gave us at minimum pretty good albums almost every year, with no signs of a creative decline, at least for me, until 1983's Body Wishes. After that, it kind of splits into a career of two halves for me, but I still think he gave us several good songs after that point, and even some respectable albums along the way as well. So that's about all for that, and I'm ready now. At the very bottom of this discography, I'm placing Human from 2001. I think a few songs in this light R&B style he did on here could have been tolerable, but for me, not a whole album. I Can't Deny It and Don't Come Around Here for me are two of the least interesting singles he ever put out. I'm definitely not against him showing his softer side, which he'd done successfully many times before, but the only way I could get through this album personally was having it on in the background. This isn't one I heard prior to doing this discography, but I knew that it didn't have a great reputation. For quite a while it seemed like this might have been the last album of original material he'd ever put out. Thankfully that didn't turn out to be the case. Next up, second to last, I have Soul Book from 2009. I just had a feeling of overall depression listening to this for a lot of it. I think of his 70s material, like soul stuff on Atlantic Crossing with This Old Heart of Mine is Weak for You. He used to be really good at changing arrangements, changing mood and making them his own. And this album, for me, has a very large feeling of being karaoke. Yeah, I feel like not a lot of artistry to what he's doing here. A lot of covers albums by him were coming out around this time, but at least with the Great American Songbook series, you could say that he was taking a risk in doing a genre that he wouldn't normally do. Only a few okay guest stars on this album keep it from being my least favourite Rod Stewart full album listening experience. I promise guys it's going to get more positive, but for now we're still pretty much at the bottom. I've got Songbook Part 3. At this point in the series of these, it's kind of like, please stop. I'll talk more at length about other qualities to the Songbook series with some of the other entries that are a little bit higher up, but for now, I had nothing really to say about this particular one. Some of the individual songs from the other songbooks I could, put on a certain Spotify playlist or something, but not really anything from here. We're sticking with the songbooks for now. Songbook Part 2. I did feel like this one fixed a flaw of the first songbooks, which was it didn't have Rod's voice so loud and high up in the mix. But the song selection continued to be very predictable here, just straight love songs for 45 minutes, which kind of gets old after a while. I did kind of like the song Don't Get Round much anymore. I added it to my Spotify. I liked it because it had a certain different lyrical focus, but apart from that, there was nothing I could really say about this album either. I wouldn't listen to it again. Up next, Songbook Part 1. At least you could say that this was the album following Human, and it was a little bit better than that. And chronologically at this stage of his career, I actually think it's quite commendable that he decided to take a risk and go into a genre that he'd never really had before. But one problem I did have with this album is that his voice was a little too high up in the mix, like I talked about on Songbook Part 2. I do love his voice. I wouldn't be a fan otherwise, but I don't think his voice is quite suited to being so next to your ear, very ear in the headphones. So that's a little thing that I didn't actually like about it compared to the songbooks before it in this list, which fixed that little problem. I'm just going to move on to the next one now because it's another songbook album, even though it was the first one. Up next, I've got The Tears of Hercules, in other words, his most recent one. Apart from that song called Kookaburra or whatever it's called, there's nothing on here that actively offends me, even though that song has a actually kind of cool 90s electronica sound that I wish he'd, maybe leaned into a little bit more on some of the other songs, even though I do find fault at times with him trying to be too modern. The rest of them are pretty typical 2010s to present day Rod Stewart original material. I kind of like the vibe of these albums, but the songs themselves are not all that great for the most part, unfortunately. Some of his 2010s or later albums do have some hidden gems on them, which I will talk about when I get to them, but on the Tears of Hercules there's nothing really that stands out for me, so that's why it's this far towards the bottom. Up next, I've got Out of Order from 1988. I do think Forever Young is a classic. Some true artistry here, even though it's half a cover, as we all know. I feel like it has purpose and it gives you chills and stuff like that. It's a nice song. But the rest of it, I never really liked it all that much. I do know My Heart Can't Tell You No, but I don't think it's one of his better singles of the 80s. And I think that this album is seen by some as sort of a comeback after, a little bit of a down period through the 80s. But personally, I think the album before this was superior to this album. So yeah, I'm still in the period of Rod Stewart's rankings where there's pretty much one great song on an album, and the rest of it I can take or leave. Up next, Vagabond Heart, the successor to Out of Order. It Takes Two with Tina Turner is a great duet. It rocks hard. And I also really like Broken Arrow. We're getting up to 2 decent songs per album here. The rest of the singles I don't like that much, although I heard them a lot growing up. I think they're some of his most played singles, perhaps in New Zealand. But overall, I feel the sound is too much on the adult contemporary side. Apart from the Tina Turner duet, like I said, which rocks pretty hard. I think this maybe could have been better with a few better written songs and maybe a sound not so geared towards making it on radio. Yeah, something about Vagabond Heart just doesn't gel with me, unfortunately. Even though I don't want to sound like I'm a hater of pop music, I think pop music done right is as difficult to pull off as any other style. I just feel like Rod doesn't do a great job of making pop music on this album for some reason. Just a little bit better than Vagabond Heart for me is Camouflage, his 1984 synth rock experiment kind of album. I do feel like, again, a fall sort of began with Body Wishes the previous year of this, and it continues in 1984 with Camouflage. Some Guys Have All the Luck is a great single, and sometimes I feel like listening to Infatuation as well. It's got a great beat and some really cool horns as well. I also think Bad For You is kind of a cool song. Can We Still Be Friends, though, like mildly depressing. And I just don't know if this album was a great example overall of the 80s synth-heavy style. I do respect him trying to branch out into something different. This album just has kind of a cold, robotic sound, which I don't think is completely suited to Rod Stewart. It's suited to some artists, but maybe not him. But I do respect him trying something out of left field a little bit. Up next, I've got Blood Red Roses, one of his later ones. I really love the song Didn't I? I think it's one of his best later songs. It starts out with that clap drum track, which makes you think at first it's going to be some more bad pop. but then the lyrics come in and it's quite hard hitting. But overall, I think the sound of this album was a little bit misguided. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how Shania Twain used to sound back in like 2002, with the way the dance beats kind of mesh with the organic country, whatever instrumentation and electric guitars. But Rod's version of it sounds even worse than that. Let me rephrase. I think Shania Twain did that sound well back in 2002, but it's 20 years later now, and like basically that's not Rod Stewart's sound for me. I do like the overall vibe of these later Stewart albums, I must say. They have a certain sunniness to them, a certain reflective quality, maturity, but I don't think the songs on them overall are all that great, except, a few gems scattered here and there. And I think Deny is actually one of the essential Rod Stewart additions to his later catalogue, I think, and I think it could hang with some of his other hits, quite easily. So that's not a bad song, but overall I didn't love this album. Up next I've got Another Country. It starts off really well with quite a beautiful song called Love Is, but then as the album goes on, apart from a couple of other decent spots, it just starts to get less and less interesting for me. I kind of wish I liked these later day Rod albums more than I do, because I think there are some surprisingly decent moments to be found on at least most of them, but overall they never turn into anything, too essential or interesting for me personally. Up next I've got Still the Same, Great Rock Classics of Our Time, 2006. I think his covers of the female original songs here from The Pretenders, I'll Stand By You, and Bonnie Tyler, It's a Heartache, are actually really good, and I think his cover of John Waite's Missing You actually surpasses the original. I think his vocal performance on this song is one of his very best later vocal performances. I think the female covers work so well because there's no male vocalist original to compare it to, so it sounds a lot newer coming from him than maybe it would if the original performers were male. But for me, although this isn't something he could ever screw up too much, because rock songs are well in his wheelhouse, I don't think his covers outside of those three ever equal or definitely not surpass the original artists. I think the studio band he's got, they really sound like studio musicians and computers for the most part. There isn't a whole lot of energy or seemingly inspiration to this whole thing. It feels like a few songs work well almost by accident. They're not a work of genius, but listenable. Next up I've got Time, his 2013 comeback album. I actually think this album has 4 pretty good songs on it. The opening track, Brighton Beach, Live the Life, and It's Over. So we're getting into the time of the ranking soon where there's going to be some pretty good songs, throughout the albums. It's going to get more positive soon, trust me. And because he'd been away so long, I think there's a certain sense of freshness to this album. It has a sunny vibe, probably the most sunny vibe he's had on one of his albums since Blondes Have More Fun all the way back in 1978. But there's also a sense of rustiness on some of the writing. Some of it feels a bit repetitive in the choruses and such. Overall, not a great Rod Stewart album for me, but I didn't mind listening to this one, and I think, like I said, there are 4 really good songs on it, which is a lot more than some of the albums below in this ranking, actually, so not too bad. Next I've got Songbook, Volume 4. At this point, yeah, it is still kind of Make It Stop, but this one wasn't as bad as some of the others. Some of the duets on it were cool, especially the one with Elton. The song's a little bit silly, but I feel like their voices kind of went well together, and Elton gave a good vocal performance as well. He actually suited the style just as much, if not more, than Rod, in my opinion. Towards the end, it kind of becomes like more of the same, but I feel like against the odds, perhaps this ends up being one of my favorite of these songbook albums for being, so late in that series. I really feel like we're sort of in the middle of the road now for Rod Stewart albums. Up next, I've got Body Wishes 1983. Like I said, I feel like this is the album that marked the end of his consistency. But I still think there are some pretty good songs on this. What Am I Gonna Do and Baby Jane are solid singles, pretty good. Baby Jane is in his top 5 on Spotify, which is interesting to me. Dancing Alone is a good opener, a good rock and roller. And I feel like Satisfied, the ballad at the end, may be a hidden gem for some. I feel like it has one of the last instances of something like his 70s sound, despite having some 80s synth work in it as well. There are a couple of grating songs on this, unfortunately, like Move Me and what's that other one? Ready Now, yeah. I don't really like those too much, but overall, there are some good songs on this, and I like the drum sound on it particularly, but overall, this is nothing too special. Up next, I've got Spanner in the Works, 1995. I don't have a whole lot specific to say about this album because I don't actually remember a whole lot about the individual songs, but I do remember that after I listened to it, I felt like, that was a pretty good, even sort of consistent listening experience from start to finish with, no major missteps or anything. So it doesn't surprise me that this album got some good reviews at the time that it came out. It's probably not an album I'm going to reach for, but I do remember having a good amount of respect for it as a complete work. Up next, I've got Songbook Part 5, and I can't believe that the very last of these is my favourite one. He finally does the very simple trick that he should have done a long time ago on that series of just throwing in some faster tempos and sort of balancing out the mood a little bit, because some of the other ones are very, very slow from start to finish. It's probably still nothing I'd ever listen to again, but considering there are no duets on it to sort of break up the vocal side of things, I think it's quite remarkable how listenable this whole thing is from start to finish. Just through adding some faster tempos and making it a little bit more lively. I can't believe it took him, 5 volumes to think of doing that, but, we get there in the end. Up next, I got Merry Christmas Baby from 2012, his only holiday album. And I think some people might be surprised that this is so high up for me, or that I even included it, but I think this is actually really good for what it is. I don't have a problem with Christmas music, and Rod does a classy version of it here, arranged in the style of his songbook series, basically. There's a pretty good new Christmas song here, a couple of nice duets, and overall I just think he did a good job with this one. I don't know if I'll remember to play it at Christmas time, but if someone else did play it around me at Christmas time, I'd be like, oh, this is kind of nice, don't have a problem with this one at all. Up next, I got When We Were the New Boys. I like his covers of Oasis and a couple of other 90s alt rock hits. I feel like he's doing alright to try and fit into that world. There's some more adult contemporary stuff, kind of like on Spanner, in the works as well, but overall, this is pretty good. The title track's quite beautiful. It goes for maximum sentimental and nostalgia, but it kind of works. Although it's not, completely unforgettable or anything, I think this is a pretty pleasant later Rod Stewart album. Alright, now we're getting into Rod albums that I actively quite like at this point. Up next, I've got Foolish Behaviour, 1980. This is part of the unbroken streak for me of pretty good albums that stretched all the way back to his debut. Very diverse feel on this album. Some great rockers, Better Off Dead especially, and She Won't Dance With Me. I feel like that one rocks really furiously. There's also a reggae flavoured track which is pretty decent, So Soon We Change. Oh God, I Wish I Was Home Tonight, mid-tempo folk rocker, kind of in the classic Rod style. I feel like that's one of his best songs of the 80s, and very underrated. I don't love Passion, the big single, that much, but I feel like it still adds to what's a diverse feel on this album and has a pretty great drum sound. Now, it's still a little bit of an uneven listen overall for me, because I feel like there are a few too many ballads on here, and none of those ballads are really great examples for me of Rod Stewart ballads. I don't find them very memorable, but overall, this is a very pleasant album. Like I said, part of his unbroken streak going back a decade at this point, so I think that's impressive in itself. Up next is Every Beat of My Heart, also titled Rod Stewart in America, I think. The title track, Every Beat of My Heart, was probably my first favourite Rod Stewart song as I was listening to what my mum used to listen to, and I still like that song a lot. I feel like there's a very distinct feel on this album for a Rod Stewart album. It feels a little bit heartland rock, the way it feels kind of earthy in a way, despite having a very 80s sound. But yeah, there are some underrated songs on this album, and I think it's one of his most underrated albums. I feel like Another Heartache and A Night Like This are upbeat anthems, basically, and I think they both have really good choruses. The Beatles cover In My Life is quite good. 10 Days of Rain has a kind of a sad, understated classiness to it. That's also slightly underrated Rod Stewart ballad. This was also a good bounce back for me after the synth rock experiment that didn't quite work, which was Camouflage. I do see this album as kind of the dividing line between, the former rock star Rod Stewart and the adult contemporary artist that would come later on, but I still think, this is really good, and this gets a lot of play for me in the car. More actually than some of the albums I like even better. Although objectively I don't think, this beats a lot of the albums that will come after this, but I do have a soft spot for Every Beat of My Heart, also called Rod Stewart. Up next I got An Old Raincoat Will Never Let You Down, the debut. This starts off his solo career really well. The guest vocalist on, I think it's I Wouldn't Change a Thing, is a nice surprise. Man of Constant Sorrow, Handbags and Glad Rags. I feel like his slow numbers in his career started out a little bit better than his fast ones. But I do also think he'd improved throughout the 70s from this point. I feel like a lot of people worship kind of raw or unpolished music just for its own sake compared to, stuff that has a little bit more pop craft, if you want to call it. But I do actually think Rod improved his song selection and writing songcraft from this point on. Next up, I've got Never a Dull Moment. I do think it's funny to hear You Wear It Well on hits compilations because it doesn't really go with any of the other big hits he has except for Maggie May, which You Wear It Well is kind of rewriting if we're being honest with ourselves. This one continues Every Picture Tells a Story's basic sound, but this time I feel like the covers of Twisting the Night Away and I'd Rather Go Blind are kind of standard stuff. They don't really stand out to me among Rod Stewart's cover versions of stuff. I think people who complain about him changing his sound a little bit as the 70s gone on should notice that on this album it did kind of feel like, although it's still very good, I feel like his sound did need a little bit of a shake-up. I don't think he could have stayed doing the same style and sort of format of album making forever. But despite having fewer memorable songs for me than some of his other early albums, I still think this is very good. Up next, Footloose and Fancy Free. I love the sound of Hot Legs and You're Insane. The slightly more sleazy rock sound those have compared to some of his other songs. Born Loose is also a great rocker. On this one, you've also got the very memorable radio hits, You're in My Heart and I Was Only Joking. So lots and lots of good songs on here. I do think some of the other songs, kind of the more mid-tempo stuff, is a little bit more forgettable, but overall this is another strong 70s album by Rod Stewart, part of his original unbroken streak for me, like I keep saying. So yeah, recommended this one. And I also like the drum sound and the general production. It sounds not too different from A Night on the Town before it, or a lot of his other 70s stuff, but this album does have a certain sound for me which I really do like. Next I got Tonight I'm Yours. This for me is easily his best album of the 80s. It's very diverse. It's got rockers, it's got 80s pop with Young Turks in the title track. It's got a bit of soul with Never Give Up on a Dream. It's got some nice mid-tempo ballads like How Long, the Dylan and the Bob Dylan cover, and Only a Boy, which I think is one of his most underrated songs ever. Yeah, and the two rockers on here are Tora 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 and Tear It Up. They're great. They're very retro style, and I don't think he'd rock quite this hard on any of his subsequent albums again. So, this is worth getting. Young Turks is the iconic song for the general public on here, but Tonight I'm Yours, the title track, both that and Young Turks, I think, were really cool ways for him to sort of enter the 80s and sort of adopt some of the sound, without being too shocking to his former audience, I guess. But they're both really cool songs. I see how Never Give Up on a Dream would be too sappy for some, but for me there's still enough of a classic soul kind of influence to it that I don't think it's too sappy. I like that song. The only song I don't really like on here is Sunny, because it is a little bit too much of a sappy ballad, but only one bad song on an album for me. I like it a lot. Next I've got Atlantic Crossing. I feel like the fast half on this album deserves a lot more credit than it gets. The feel these rockers have, I don't think any other Rod Stewart rockers had a feel quite like these. They feel kind of alcoholic, hazy, druggy, but still quite energetic and, rocking. But yeah, there's something cool and detached and, a little bit sort of out of it about them, which I think is cool. But the slow half here is the more famous half because of Sailing and I Don't Want to Talk About It. Both of those songs are classics, but I also really like his cover of This Old Heart of Mine Is Weak For You. It's slow and soulful and also a nice funky influence in the rhythm. Yeah, just good stuff all around here. A couple of weaker songs, but mostly in the slow half, but nothing too bad. I feel like this is very similar, almost tied in quality with A Night on the Town, but A Night on the Town just has a certain song that's a little bit more of a artistic lyrical statement, which I think it puts it just a little bit above it for me, but the two are very close. Alright, time for my top 5. And up next is the album I just mentioned, A Night on the Town. This is pretty technically excellent. A lot of big hits on here. I do feel like there's, technically better production on the rockers this time. The Bull Trap is especially great for me, but maybe a bit less distinct in the druggy feel of them that Atlantic Crossing kind of has, but that's really no problem, due to the album's consistency. First Cut is the deepest, one of his most famous covers, and really illustrates his ability to, just change arrangement and feel of the song and sort of make it his own. I used to think the closing track, Trade Winds, was an awful song, but, re-listening to it, I don't think it's nearly as bad as I once thought it was. It's still the weakest on the album for me, but it's really nothing too bad. The reason I'm placing this a little bit above Atlantic Crossing is for the song The Killing of Georgie, which I think is a landmark piece of songwriting for Rod, and if he'd done more songs like it, then I think the critics maybe might have sat up and took more notice, but obviously his heart wasn't always in the social commentary stuff, which is fine. Not everybody is. Some people just feel like writing that way sometimes, and some people don't at all, and it's fine. That's not who he is as an artist, and but I do really like that song and respect it a lot. Alright, up next, my number 4, Blondes Have More Fun. Is this a surprise? I don't think it should be. I think this is a really good album. I think all the songs are different in mood and style from one another. I see why people, may not have liked the fact that he, went disco with "Do You Think I'm Sexy," but I always liked that song personally. This is definitely his most pop album up to that point, but I think it works for this album. It still has, rock, a bit of folk influence, and ballads and all that stuff. But there's just a little coat of polish on everything, which it works for me. It's fine. And I don't think this album has any of his individually most memorable songs outside of "Do You Think I'm Sexy," but I just think start to finish, it's pretty much flawless album listening experience. I also think it's distinct among his catalogue for having a particularly summery feel throughout the entire album. Most of his other albums definitely don't have that, even though they're still fun in a lot of places. I feel like there's a certain summery cohesion to this album as well. So overall, yeah, it's my fourth favorite. Take it or leave it. My number three is Smiler. I don't get the criticism that this album gets. It is covers heavy, and but it sounds awesome. And I actually do think that this album changes its emphasis from folk rock kind of acoustic guitars to more upbeat rock and roll and pianos, and just a more retro kind of rock and roll, old style rock and roll feel on the faster numbers. I think it's great. Of course, there's still a little bit of leftover folk influence, so it's not shockingly different from the albums that had come before, but I think this is a good bridge from his earlier sound to the sound of that his albums would take for the rest of the 70s. I even like the acoustic instrumental towards the end of the album. Yeah, Smiler rules. Like I said, I don't know why this album is so ignored or disliked among his early stuff. Number two, I have Gasoline Alley, which means that, yes, the general consensus pick is my number one. But the title track, Only a Hobo, Joe's Lament, You're My Girl, I Don't Want to Discuss It, all great songs. Oh, and of course It's All Over Now. So, I don't actually think, perhaps unpopular opinion, but I don't actually think that the form of Rod Stewart's music changed as dramatically as some people do throughout the rest of the 70s. Like, he still did, retro style rock and roll and tender acoustic based ballads on his later stuff like he did on these early albums. So, yeah, I don't think the change was that dramatic, except I would agree that there's a certain intangible cool to his early albums that maybe he lost a little bit later on, but actual good music, I think he kept it up for quite a long time. But getting back to this album, I don't think this is quite start to finish the perfectly even listen that Every Picture Tells a Story is, but this is still great stuff. That means my number one is Every Picture Tells a Story. I think this album has the reputation it does for a reason. I feel like this is that Rod Stewart album you can just leave it on and everything's great. Maggie May isn't actually one of my favourite Rod Stewart singles, but it works great as an album track. Like, I wouldn't skip it, while the album's playing, definitely not. It's quite artistic while having a sense of casual coolness. It's amazing how much rocking the opening track, the title track, turns out to be, despite being so acoustic guitar based. One thing I will acknowledge that changed about his output later is that on this album, especially where it comes together great, I feel like there's a real cool jam band session kind of feeling to the songs. A certain, again, a certain casual coolness about it. I do feel like he gave us some really great rock and rollers, up until all the way to 1983, say, with Dancing Alone, the opening track off Body Wishes, but definitely the songs later on that were rocking definitely didn't have quite that same jamming band feel, which I think really worked for his early stuff. I Know I'm Losing You is one of his best covers. Seems like a long time. Nice country style number. Mandolin Wind, very pretty, folky ballad like he'd do later on. So there are shades of his later stuff even on this album. But like I said, although I don't think the form of his music changed as much as some people do, you gotta acknowledge that these early albums did have a certain feeling that the other ones didn't. Um, I don't think he lost a lot artistically until 1983, like I keep on saying, but I don't think anything in his catalog quite beats the consistency and the coolness of this album. Every picture tells a story. So that is my number one, like so many other people have. And that's it. That's my Rod Stewart albums discography ranking. I know it seems like it would have been an epic, long slog of a journey to, listen to albums, to rank them in a discography this large. But truth be told, I've heard a lot of these albums many times since quite a few years ago now. It was really just a matter of listening to some of the later stuff, basically. Which was fun. I didn't necessarily like all those albums a great deal, but out of respect to the artist, to complete the discography and to assess things fairly, it wasn't too bad to listen to even to the later stuff. There were some hidden gems on that later stuff too. So that's basically it. In the comments, I want to know which Rod Stewart albums you guys think deserve a little bit more recognition than they get. How wrong was I? Should I have had different stuff lower and higher? What do you guys think? I'm also interested to know if you guys agree with me that Rod Stewart's peak was 1970 to 1981. Like I think, would you extend that time period or would you shrink it a bit? What do you guys say? Alright, guys. Bye.